I think I'm live. Okay, I continue reading A Lot to Remember. It's a book by Joan Marshall Grant about her travels. I read here her dedication. It was published in 1962, and she's dedicating it to Denys and Charles with love for A Lot to Remember. Lot is also the name of a French village where they visited often. She is here going back into history. Um, we are on chapter 4. In chapter 4, ELEANOR of Aquitaine. Aquitaine. Eleanor became Duchess of Aquitaine in 1137, when she was only 15. Her lands were almost as wide as those ruled by the dying Louis VI. So he sent the Dauphin hastening to Bordeaux to marry her. On their wedding journey, he became Louis VII and she the Queen of France. He was wise, brave, gay, and beautiful. But even at 17, Louis was such an arid young man that his ministers had to order him to her bed. In spite of his being, as she herself phrased it, more of a monk than a man, she managed to present him with two daughters. But Louis did not want daughters, he wanted a son, and in the hope of persuading God to grant this boon, he made several pilgrimages to shrines within his realm, including one to the shrine of Roc Amadour in the Lot. When this was also when this also proved fruitless, although they had been married for 10 years, he reluctantly decided that God would not relent until he had been on a crusade. When he informed his queen of this decision, she agreed that it was a wise one, and then dismayed him by pointing out that it would prove ineffective unless she came too. He did his best to dissuade her, and so did his monks and ministers, but Eleanor stood firm. If she had to stay at home, then she would all the knights that so would all the knights of her duchy, knights who, as everyone knew, outshone and outnumbered those who owed their fealty only to the king. So on the sound ethical principle that it is a woman's duty to teach men to make love instead of war, and should she fail in this to share war's perils with him, the queen and 50 of her ladies set off for the Holy Land. It was an arduous and dangerous journey, on which the women acquitted themselves admirably, and Eleanor, who, when an ambush was suspected, rode in the van with her knights, gained their even more fervent devotion by her unfailing endurance and courage. When at last they reached their destination, she was delighted to find that conditions were far more congenial than she or Louis had anticipated. Instead of aesthetic warriors just managing to hold their own against the Saracen, he found that the knights who had remained there after the first crusade, among them was her gay and devoted uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, had built themselves castles where they lived in far greater luxury than Louis had ever enjoyed at home. Not that Louis would have enjoyed luxury, for it is doubtful if he ever enjoyed anything except penances. These, to the acute embarrassment of his hosts and their retainers, he frequently indulged while they walked in close ranks on either side of him, so as to conceal from the local inhabitants the undignified and unsettling spectacle of a king shuffling painfully to a shrine on his knees. Had Eleanor always lived in her gay duchy, she would probably have been far too contented to play a vital part in history. But in the drab, narrow minded court of Paris, where she was constantly rebuked for her virtues by her masochistic husband, she stored up sufficient repressed energy for its release to result in the increased happiness of thousands of other men and women. Now, while Louis engaged in ineffective battles with the infidel who continued to occupy Jerusalem, she was in the care of her indulgent uncle and free to think and to act, to her to be herself, her real self. She learned how life for men as well as for women could become an art instead of an exercise in endurance. And she also acquired the materials for the background of this resurgence of living. Eagerly she accepted the comforts which had not yet penetrated to her part of Europe, although they had been commonplace for centuries in the Middle East. Henceforth, in her castles and in the castles of those who owed her fealty, there would be carpets on the floors instead of rushes, arrows on the walls, privies even for the men at arms. Women would dress to make themselves more beautiful, dress in silk and velvet and gaze, instead of bundling themselves in coarse wool to keep out the cold. Although the Pope, whom they visited on their way home, had personally packed them into a magnificently appointed bed, erected for this express purpose in a room adjoining his oratory, she still failed to give Louis the son he craved, but instead did her best to put her new ideas into operation. The monkish Louis, or Louis, saw only one way out of this unbearable situation. He could not cope with his now rebellious wife, so he must divorce her. And divorce her he did in 1152, overriding the objections, both secular and religious, of his advisers, with the plea that, although Aquitaine is desirable, an heir is essential to France. Lesser women would have been subdued by this indignity, but not Eleanor. She had already fallen in love with a man of her own stature, Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, and neither of them was in the least dismayed by the fact that he happened to be 12 years younger than herself. 2 months after the divorce, she married him, and within 5 months presented him with a son. With a husband who not only loved but appreciated her, she, the ideas sown in Eleanor's fertile mind soon abundantly fruited. He set the fashions in which we still clothe the figures of the Arthurian legends and the romances of the Middle Ages, and when it became widely known that the Duchess permitted no man, however well born, to enter her presence with his hair unkempt as a shock of barley, those who came seeking brides at her court adopted clothes as decorative as the women's. Under Eleanor's influence, the arts flourished, especially the arts of music and poetry, and the troubadours she inspired sang her praises throughout Europe. Her courts of love were properly convened courts, presided over by Eleanor and later by her daughter, at which both boys and girls could seek advice on their affairs of the heart, and where women could gain redress against husbands or lovers. When a man was found guilty of unethical behavior, even if this were only by being a bore or a braggart or a bully, his punishment, which continued until he had made full amends, was subtle but exceedingly effective. He was completely ignored by the women. No woman would speak with him, serve him, or even glance in his direction, and if he were brazen enough to enter the tilting yard, the female spectators either withdrew or turned their backs until his joust was over. Eleanor, by her marriage to Henry, had added Anjou, Maine, and Touraine to the great possessions over which they ruled. Within 2 years, these also included Normandy, for her husband, as Henry II became Duke of Normandy when he succeeded to the English throne. To do justice to the history of Eleanor, will take at least 250,000 words, 4 times as many as there are in this book. So I can here give only a few highlights of her story. By Henry she had 5 sons and 3 daughters. The eldest, William, died in boyhood. The next, Henry, nicknamed Courtmantle, of whom I shall say more later, remarried her ex-husband's daughter, born of Louis's second marriage. Geoffrey was made Count of Anjou, and the 2 youngest, Richard and John, became kings of England during her lifetime. After 20 years of happy marriage with Henry, in which she had only one enemy to marital peace, the king's favourite, Thomas à Becket, they quarrelled so bitterly that she left England and withdrew to her duchy, taking all her children with her except John, whom she left with his father. She loved all her children. On Richard she lavished her devotion that Henry, under Becket's influence, had sorrowfully rejected. To make Richard independent, she gave him her duchy, which so infuriated Henry that he brought an army to France, intending to administer a sharp lesson to filial obedience. But Eleanor had been far-seeing enough to keep on good terms with her first husband's children, and Philip, the son of Louis's old age, who had recently succeeded to the throne of France, sent troops to support Richard against his father. Richard would have won even without this assistance, for most of his father's troops changed sides at the first battle. It would have been bitter enough for Henry if his troops had deserted through cowardice, but to see them turn against him on the field, ready to fight for their rights to stay in what they had already thought of their own country, an English province, in which the laws protecting the landless were so much more benign than the laws at home. That was a blow to his pride from which Henry never recovered. But it is primarily because of Eleanor that even to this day there are many families in the lot who are proud of being descended from the English, who came not as conquerors, but through rightful inheritance to govern beneficently for nearly 300 years. Hmm. So the next chapter is chapter 4, Ferdinand the Lesser.